Good afternoon and welcome to this event as part of the book fair at CAA 2021, in which we are hosted by Bloomsbury Academic Books. And we're here to discuss a number of publications in a series called New Encounters. I am the series editor, Griselda Pollock, and we are going to introduce that now. Now, I'm going to talk about the series in general, and today we have three of the authors who will be present to talk about the latest books. Now, New Encounters, Arts, Cultures and Concepts is a series of books that have been published in the last 10, 12 years, and they take different forms. Some, as you can see at the top, are edited collections. So we have Conceptual Odysseys, Passages to Cultural Analysis, The Sacred and the Feminine, Imagination and Sexual Difference, Bluebeard's Legacy, Death and Secrets from Bartok to Hitchcock, Digital and Other Virtualities, Renegotiating the Image, and Visual Politics of Psychoanalysis, Art and the Image in Post-Traumatic Cultures. So you can see that these are books which have topics, themes, which will be played out across the visual arts, cinema, some cases literature, in some cases theory, and that if you look at some of the images, you can see Trinity Minha's film in terms of digital and other virtualities, Night Passage on the cover. On the cover of Visual Politics is a scene from Alfredo Jar's Rwanda. So it's an interdisciplinary project based on encounters. We also have monographs, and this monograph, Helen Frankenthaler, Painting History, Writing, Painting, an exploration of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 2000s, major American painter. Vanessa Corby writing on Eva Hesse, Longing, Belonging and Displacement, and Nicholas Scher on Auschwitz and After Images, Abjection, Witnessing and Representation. So these are single authored books. And our latest, which we're going to talk about later, by Elisabeth Bronfen, Cross Mappings, edited by Gil Pasternak, Visioning Israel-Palestine, Imagining Culture Beyond the Conflicts of the Boundaries of Conflict, and Isabelle de la Cour, Post-Traumatic Art in the City Between War and Cultural Memory in Sarajevo and Beirut. We also have a mini-series, a sort of sub-series within New Encounters called Concentrationary Memories, The Politics of Representation, and there are 2 volumes within that. So let me just explain the origins of this series and why it's important. We subtitle it Transdisciplinary Cultural Analysis with Disciplinary Lenses. There was a period where interdisciplinarity was the key thing, but we felt that there were bigger questions to be posed around the notion of how we study visual art, particularly as I was an art historian, what is happening to art history, but there'd been expansion of a field called visual culture that displaced the historical to focus more on the issues of the function of the image and drawing a different series of theoretical propositions. Then obviously there is cultural studies, a much broader area, and the emergence of a form of practice called cultural analysis. What is the relations between all of these and their relationship between art, art history, visual studies, and also what was going on after a very rich period of theoretical expansion and development in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Are we in a post-theoretical era? What do we do with this rich intellectual revolution that took place from structuralism through to postmodernism and in psychoanalysis, literary theory, philosophy, and in the actual practices of the visual arts? What are the new directions? And the question, to what should we remain loyal? So New Encounters put together arts, cultures, concepts to propose some ways of thinking through these questions that seemed very urgent in the beginning of the 21st century. The first thing we did was to create transdisciplinary initiative, which does not mean that everybody's being interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but that there is a bringing together of different ways of thinking that create the notion of research that happens through transdisciplinary encounter. Now, how does that work? So when we bring together transdisciplinary and encounter, we mark the interaction between specific disciplinary and theoretically aligned ways of thinking, doing, and making in the arts and humanities. They have different protocols, they have different priorities. Each produces a useful way of thinking, but also they can challenge each other when they come together because they retain their distinctive features of the disciplinary practices. And yet new knowledge is produced when these different ways of doing, thinking, and making encounter each other across concepts, concepts that can circulate between these different sites in order to be looked at, as it were, in a prism that changes the facet or aspect of the concept as it looked at through specific practices. So concepts circulate between different intellectual or aesthetic discourses and cultures. They inflect them, they share common questions, but they may approach them in distinctly articulated practices, which we still need to be precise in the way that we analyze them. So the aim is to place these different practices in productive encounter with each other, mediated by the circulation of shared concepts. So our first book was called Conceptual Odysseys, Passages to Cultural Analysis. And it was a conversation in part with the person who articulated a concept of cultural analysis that falls between and transcends literary theories, biblical studies, psychoanalysis, art history, which is Isabelle. And she wrote a book called Traveling Concepts in the Humanities at the beginning of the 21st century, in which she drew attention to a shift from massive theoretical alignments, are you a structuralist, a Foucauldian, a Marxist, a Lacanian, these kinds of orders of theoretical thinking, and said all of this creativity in the intellectual dynamics of the humanities at the end of the 21st century had generated a range of concepts which can move from the site of their origin. For instance, frame originates in art history, but it become a concept that can be used in a series of other sites of the arts and humanities. And this excited me greatly because I suddenly thought, yes, this is the legacy of a certain kind of dedicated theoretical interventions. Now we have these concepts which can travel and become form part of what she was going to call a practice of cultural analysis, which did not find itself tide bound by saying, okay, art history has to be historical, and visual culture doesn't concern itself with history or aesthetics, and cultural studies doesn't actually specify particular notions of the visual or arts. It deals more with life processes and cultural practices. So we had these rich diversions, but what happens when we find concepts coming from each of them and traveling across them? So the first book, as you can see, is about working with concepts where things like framing, agency, the mirror, trauma, life mapping, puncture, punctum, history, nostalgia, pedagogy, efficacity, commitment. This is not thinking in terms of a study of a particular literary work or an artistic work or a theory. It's concept-led. And so these books that are the edited collections have in common a very wide range of topics and a wide range of media, but they are brought together and examined by different scholars working through the questions posed by, for instance, Death and Secrets from Bartok to Hitchcock, the legacies of male violence as seen through the figure of Bluebeard. How does this work out? How does it occur? How does it transform itself so that you don't even realize you're watching a Bluebeard movie or reading a Bluebeard book? It doesn't advertise itself, but we draw out from it the continuities and repetitions and transformations. The sacred and feminine imagination and sexual difference. This was picking up on Kristeva and Catherine Clément's idea of the feminine and the sacred. This question about the fold, as she calls it, between life and meaning, between the body and the sign, and how sexual difference, the question of sexuality, but also the question of masculinity, femininities intersect with that at the level of the different scales at which this is imagined, whether it's in art or theology or in literature. And the visual politics of psychoanalysis was particularly concerned with the ideas of the different ways that the psychoanalytical feeds into the practices of image making, and particularly the practices of reading, studying, analyzing, and working with and creating images. The monographs enable a deep study of a particular topic, perhaps more, Helen franked it more conventionally in terms of art history, and Auschwitz and after images. The key question was, what are the terms of, which he's arguing, abjection, witnessing, and representation when we deal with something of the scale and challenge of the trauma of the events that are associated with Auschwitz. And finally, the concentrationary memories, the politics of representation, is a series of studies in which the key concept is the concentrationary, but takes up the concept of memory studies, and also the question of the unconscious, the persistent, the kind of what one could call kind of the political unconscious or the political imaginary of societies which witnessed in the 20th century the invention of totalitarianism and in fascism, and the enactment of it, and it questions its legacy. So that gives you an overview of the series in which we're now going to talk about three very, very important new publications which we are launching with this project. And I'm now going to hand over to my first speaker, who is Elisabeth Bronfen. Oh, sorry. These are our publications. And so Elisabeth Bronfen is going to talk about cross mappings.
Thank you, Griselda, for also making this publication possible in your series. What the book Cross Mapping does is bring together a set of essays that document my work in visual culture in the past 20 years or so. And many of the essays in the book Cross Mapping are the result of conversations that I've had with artists who were interested in my work because they knew Over a Dead Body and were interested in the relationship between femininity and death, or they knew the book The Knotted Subject and were interested in questions of hysteria, or these essays were the result of talking with curators who were putting together shows related to issues that they thought that I could address. And the two points of focus in all of these essays really are, on the one hand, a feminist gaze on women artists. That is to say, what does it mean to look at artists who are concerned with feminist issues, or what does it mean to give a specifically feminist reading of a set of artworks? And this obviously has to do with depiction of women, but also just questions of gender. And the second important approach that I take in these articles is that, of course, I come to visual culture as someone who started out in literary studies. That is to say, I'm interested in reading images and reading them through theory, through theoretical concepts, to pick up on a point, Griselda, that you made earlier. And the concepts and the theoretical questions that I'm particularly interested in are those having to do with psychoanalysis and semiotics. And when I say I'm interested in the kind of the way that a psychoanalytic and feminist approach to these artworks is important to me, then it's usually in relationship to not what we see in the image, but things that have to do with that elude the image, because my focus is on something which within psychoanalysis we would delegate to the realm of the real, which is to say how the real is negotiated through the imaginary, obviously also in relationship to symbolic codes, but how do we think and conceptualize and visualize death, trauma, pain, the ecstatic, or even in one of the books that I was also interested in, The Night. So it's always, for me, a question of how something is contained in the double sense of the word. That is to say, an aesthetic formalization preserves something, an intensity, and at the same time delimits it in such a way that in fact it can be formulated, it can be articulated, it can be recycled, and it can be renegotiated. Now, the title cross mappings is a concept that I have coined, and I've coined it in conversation with several theorists. The perhaps most important of them, and also I know very much an inspiration for Griselda Pollock's work, also in this series, is Abi Warburg and Abi Warburg's work on pathos formula, that is to say on the aesthetic formulas that, as I've already said, contain intensities or energies, that both preserve them but also delimit them in order for them to have what Warburg called a Nachleben. This is a form of cultural persistence, a kind of cultural sustainability, one could say, and also kind of cultural afterlife. So it's the formalization which initially it made the intensity into something that could be articulated, that could be visualized, that could be narrated. And what subsequent recyclings pick up on is, on the most obvious level, the formalization, but by recycling, appropriating, refiguring this formalization, what is also transmitted is this intensity. And it is that play together of intensity and form that I'm particularly interested in most of these articles, because I try to do something very similar to what Warburg does with his Mnemosyne Atlas, which is to say he, of course, is only interested in certain visual gestures, and then he takes many examples and places them on his blackboards. But the important point was not just that he would collect all these different images, for example, of a nymph and the movement of her foot, but that he would bring into conversation on these blackboards images from from antiquity, from 18th century painting, but also very contemporary, for him, contemporary images from advertisement. The important point for me here isn't the actual content of these atlases that he produces, but rather the idea of thinking in associations, that is to say, a kind of montage technique, thinking in series and in serialities, to see when I place images or texts next to each other, what then do I notice that I wouldn't have noticed otherwise? So this idea of the formalization of intensities and then looking at a sequence of them is one of the things that cross-mapping does by mapping various texts onto each other. The second theorist, and we've already heard Nick about, that is important for my thinking is her work on what she calls preposterous history, where basically in her work she looks at Caravaggio and the way that we can rethink Caravaggio in relationship to artists who have subsequently recycled him. But I take from her this idea of a preposterous gaze, looking at something prior through the lens of something that came afterwards. And this is what I do in many of these pieces, and this in a sense is the kind of cross I'm interested in, looking at a, let's say, contemporary television show in relationship to a Shakespeare play. So the cross is both a cross historical one, namely between contemporary moment, early 20th century, and the early modern period, but it is also cross in the sense of cross media or transmedia, moving from play to television drama. And the third theorist that I would just want to bring into play is someone whom I feel myself in conversation as well, is the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, who in fact was one of the first people to suggest that it may be worthwhile thinking through the kind of problems of skepticism that he's interested in relationship to Shakespeare by looking at similar problems that are raised, not explicitly, of course, but implicitly in a set of films that he was particularly interested in, namely Hollywood comedies of the 30s and 40s that he called the comedies of remarriage. And again, it's not the texts themselves that he's using, but the process that he suggests, namely that you look at texts, bring them in conversations with each other because they have common themes, they have common constellations and concerns, not in relationship to intention or influence, but rather once you've discovered an analogy, much like Warburg is interested in coming up with a series of images based on a common formalization. Once you've discovered this analogy, what does that then mean for an individual reading? So again, it's the question of persistence that I'm interested in. Something persists over generations, over centuries, and finds a re-articulation. And again, what I would be interested in these cross mappings is not just to map a prior text onto a later text and say there are similar concerns that keep resurfacing at certain historical moments, even if in different media. But what I'm then also interested in, what changes? What is different when a certain set of concerns that we can find in queenship in Shakespeare, for example, is picked up again in American television drama about the first female president? And why is it important that something has changed, not just that something has persisted? So the cross and cross mappings is taken in part from the notion of cross-dressing, because I'm always interested in gender appropriations and how certain issues of gender can be refigured and rewritten. It is also, of course, the crossover between high and low culture, or a crossover between different media, from drama or literature through opera to film or photography. And important for cross also for me is this oscillating gaze, because as I say, I'm interested in the real. So it's the transformation of the body into sign, or into that which is ungraspable, like trauma or death, into a sign, and how things like violence, pain, or affects can be formalized, can be transmitted, how they are part and parcel of fantasy work, what aesthetic practices are able to expose, but also what in the process of exposing or articulating, what do they then hide? And part and parcel of that, and this I think has very much to do with the question of gender as well, is when do we avert our gaze because we do not want to see, for example, as Cavell would put it, the otherness of the other, because we do not want to see sexual difference. And what does it mean not to overlook? What does it mean to look differently? So not overlooking, looking differently is in a sense what I try to do in many of these articles. And just briefly to say why the two parts. In the first part, picking up on Mika Baal's notion of traveling concepts, I speak about traveling image formula. And here I'm interested in representations of women, how the notion of portraiture, the nude, or the tableau vivant finds a kind of cultural legacy, how it is revisited, or what it means for us to revisit that archive, to look at how artists refigure this tradition, or how we in our readings of this tradition might rethink it. But this also includes a relationship between pop culture and high art, especially in an article which I called Hitler Goes Pop, where I was interested in taking the notion of fascist aesthetics from Susan Sontag and looking at the way cinema worked with that in order to distinguish between a filmmaker like Riefenstahl and the body choreography that we find in the Busby Berkeley musicals that one likes to see in relationship to fascist art or fascist aesthetics. But that does something very different once we look at distinctly how the bodies and the body formations work. And in a similar vein, you can then bring Disney in here as well. And as I've already mentioned, another kind of a crossover that I'm interested in as something that travels is the notion of Shakespearean drama as it resurfaces in contemporary television drama, most notably in the article that I have here on The Wire, and how it thinks back the 4 plays that Shakespeare wrote about the War of the Roses. And the second part, which I've called Gendering the Uncanny, Imaging Death, really looks at various aspects of how death and mortality, the trauma of the fragility of life has been formalized, especially also in relationship to gender. So it's not just the way gender for Freud is from the start an uncanny category because the masculine and the feminine are not easily delineated, but also how various artists have interrogated and negotiated what is a cultural commonplace for us, namely the alignment between the feminine and fragility or vulnerability or death. And here the artists I particularly focus on are artists like Cindy Sherman, Eva Hesse, Elisha Attila, and Louise Bourgeois. But I'm also interested in a kind of appropriation of the feminine by artists, particularly Duchamp and Picasso, along, of course, with the way that Freud himself appropriates the feminine for his psychoanalytic thinking. So in general, and this is how the notion both of thinking through encounters in relationship to concepts comes into play. It's really, essays are really about revisiting an archive and looking at things differently, and thinking of cross-mapping not as something that the artworks give us, but something that we do so that it becomes an operative practice. That is to say, by virtue of coming up with analogies, mapping texts onto each other, coming up with sequences, seeing both how certain concerns have a kind of cultural persistence, but also how we can look at them against the grain. And this often means either discovering or redefining a lineage, thus also the question what we want to continue to be loyal to, and ask ourselves why at certain historic moments, certain concerns, and thus also certain artworks and films have meaning again, so that overall what I'm proposing with cross mappings is really a kind of creative reading, that is to say, producing these maps that are heuristically valuable. And that also means, and this is something I take both from Freud and from Warburg, that this is a work in progress, that you can keep realigning the maps, adding to the maps, changing the maps, depending on what further material is brought into play.
Thank you, Elisabeth, so very much for that beautiful account of the book and the underpinning of it. We will now move on to the second speaker, who is Isabelle de la Cour, who is going to talk about her concept, which is the post-traumatic city.
Thank you, Griselda. So the book is really, it really introduces a parallel in terms of trauma, conflict, and civil war between two cities, Sarajevo, which is the capital city of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Lebanon, which is the capital city of, and Beirut, which is the capital city of Lebanon, that you can see here. So what is really important in the book is that we have to deal with cities and which are actual physical places. And when we think about these two cities, we think always of their connections to war. We don't think so often in terms of art. And this is what the book is trying to do. Just to remind you that these two cities until the beginning of the 20th century were both part of the Ottoman Empire, so they were in the same geographical area and more or less under the same rules, so what we forget. These two cities have in common, of course, the traumatic events that we all know about, of violence and conflict, which took place at the end of 20th century and since 1975 in Beirut. Beirut is very special in a way because it's just an endless chain of violence and traumatic events. And I was working on the second proofs of the book when the explosion happened on the 4th of August. And I will come back to that at the end of my very small presentation, because this will have a huge impact on the art. It had a huge impact, I mean, on the population and on the artistic scene. And artists are slowly starting now to work and to think about how they can actually process into the artistic practice this explosion that happened in the port of Beirut last August. The book acts really on different levels, so I singled out 4 artistic practices by 4 women, which are actually 2 Bosnian and 2 Lebanese. And what is really also interesting is that the first example that you have here is a self-portrait by Danica Dakic that she did in 1999, and she exhibited in a big exhibition at the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen in Düsseldorf. And what is interesting for me is that trauma is always connected to a place, but the artist doesn't have to be or to be living through the events, because Danica was actually studying in Düsseldorf when the war started in Sarajevo, and she had no contacts to her family at all during the siege of Sarajevo. And that's also why she blinded herself in this video installation, and she endowed her own face with a second mouth. And this is the way it was functioning. So the artistic practices I chose are all singled out in terms of different patterns relating to the use of a specific media on formal or narrative devices. So here we have a video installation. The next one, next please, this is a series of performances done by Maja Bajevic with refugees women from the Srebrenica area. So women who were expelled from Srebrenica, who lost their husbands, their sons, their brothers, and were brought to Sarajevo, which was a city they didn't know. And then and Maja Bajevic started to work together with these women to give them more visibility and to perform with them, which is in terms of performance. The third artist I worked on was Lamia Jorej, the Lebanese, who is really trying to investigate into a family past, and because her grandmother was born in Palestine and grew up in Palestine in the 1920s, and then came to Lebanon, and she's really trying to work on 3 generations of women, so her grandmother, her mother, and herself, and the way different generations are facing historical events and are trying to interpret historical events. And so she's connected to all the movement in the Middle East, I mean, in the 20th century, and the war in Lebanon, and also the fact that one of her uncles got abducted during the war in Lebanon and was never found. And it is a huge issue in Lebanon because you have about 17,000 people who disappeared and were never been found. So the artist is really trying to mediate a family history, memory, family narratives, and the archived in this video or film. She calls it herself a film. And the last artist and artistic practice has more to do with a landscape, with the urban landscape, but also with a countryside landscape, and it's Paula Yahoub, also a Lebanese artist. And she really deals with the fabric of the city of Beirut, and she really works on the relationship between the city and the post-war landscapes, and the way actually these elements are related through the circulation of architectural elements. So she has a very careful photographic consideration, and she intends to let her camera displace what cannot be talked about, and she never talks about the war as such, because of a Lebanese official politics of amnesia that may be aware of, so that there is a political amnesia in Lebanon, which is still very much on today. And so there is no historical book about the war. There is no national history, book of history in the schools that actually children can relate to. And you have these different narratives and different experiences of the war that really sometimes fail to connect. So the book is, excuse me, the book is important because it brings together the post-war art scenes of Sarajevo and Beirut for the first time. And of course, the cities did not experience the same chain of events, but they are related to each other through unprecedented violence of trauma and the post-traumatic. And I really tried also to keep their own specificities, of course, in the book, and trying to bring them into a kind of a dialogue. The book thinks about the relations between art and place, outlining 2 specific major lines of reflection. It uses the axis of space and time to examine both the situation in the 2 cities involved and the 4 artistic practices. This introduces a new dimension into the field of trauma studies, which has tended to deal with arrested timelessness and buried space. The spatial axis arises from the fact that the artworks analyzed in the book can be read as coming from or dealing with a situation of exile and expatriation. At the same time, these artworks involve a sense of temporality through their preoccupations with history, memory, remembrance, invisibility, and the unsayable. Another central question of the book, of course, is how war, understood not as a military action, but as a civilian experience of prolonged traumatizing violation of the conditions of life, and are remembered or not, and how they are aesthetically mediating. And when I'm talking about aesthetics, it's not a kind of aestheticizing the war. It is not really, it's really not what the artists are doing here. And it's also very important to stress that the artworks do not produce a kind of vicarious trauma in the viewers. They call for another kind of reading, materializing an absence or oblivion into the kind of perception close to memory. Excuse me. So I have chosen really to study artworks that concern the reality of the traumatic events as it is owned by someone, and how the artworks invite the audience in a way to take part in this experience through the raising of an affective or empathic encounter that engages the views by aesthetic means. So what I said is not aestheticizing, but intensifying the sense of sight, of feeling, of space, of memory and affect. And the book engages with the way everyday life, both during and after a conflict, has been registered as individual or collective lived experiences, particularly through the work of the artist. So the artist here is really an active witness, and also these experiences, often connected to a political or a social context, are conveyed by the artist into his or her artworks. The artist is positioned at once inside and outside, but is affected and thus moved to make the work also responsible for making works that can engage non-participant viewers to grasp the trauma of political violence and the politics of a violence that is traumatic. And I think I'm finished with my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabelle. Okay, and now we'll move on to our third presentation, which is by Gil Pasternak, who is in the UK, and the concept here is visioning. Gil, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Griselda and April, for organizing this wonderful event and providing this opportunity to talk about our books. As you can see from the first slide, I'm going to talk about an edited volume, Visioning Israel-Palestine, which aspires to expand the conflict's historical imagination to further compassionate ways of thinking about the people of Israel-Palestine, and it considers how creative methods may better their shared future in the country. In this respect, the volume takes its cue from a major text by Edward Said titled Invention, Memory, and Place. Yes, the next slide, thank you. It's a text that he published in 2000, not so long before he passed away, and it is reproduced in the book as an anchor for the 9 book chapters. Said argued in that text that, at least since the 1970s, both Israelis and Palestinians, from left and from right, have used cultural media to formulate collective memories of separation, namely memories that either exclude or demonize the other national community. But at the same time, as shown in one of his quotations on the screen, Said also noted that everywhere in the territory of historical Palestine, Jews and Palestinians live together. Not only that, he noted in addition that Israelis and Palestinians are in fact so intertwined through history, geography, and political actuality that it would be folly to plan the future of one nation or national community without taking into consideration that of the other. So in terms of the book, what I took from Said basically is that he actually acknowledged the reality of life in Israel-Palestine as a way to consider how Israelis and Palestinians could encounter each other, not as enemies, but as communities of suffering that adhere to conflicting collective memories and narrations of the historical past. In this sense, following Edward Said, the book considers culture and cultural products or practices as components equally necessary for analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as for Israeli and Palestinian transformation. In other words, the volume takes Said's words seriously, signaling that anyone interested in seeing a peaceful end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must promote the dissemination of cultural products that can enable Israelis and Palestinians to encounter each other away from the theater of national politics, where the more mainstream national cultures of their people are at least momentarily suspended. In such a non-conformist space, according to Said, Israelis and Palestinians could possibly rework their memories, realities, and knowledge of each other, and pave the way as a consequence towards sustained reconciliation. If I could have the next slide, please. So the book focuses on the medium of culture to make visible the changing realities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which politicians and the media tend to suspend for rhetorical impact. It pays specific attention to cultural products that reframe violence, destruction, and the controlled separation of Israelis and Palestinians as significant, but also as limited expressions of the realities the conflict has triggered. In other words, the authors recognize the common wish of Israelis and Palestinians to embed their pain and suffering in cultural products as a way to commemorate loss, resist power politics, and cultivate community and public support. At the same time, they guard against the slippage of such cultural works into banal objects of curiosity and ahistorical registers of violence. In fact, most of the authors in the volume consider cultural practices that exist alongside or even beyond the conflict's mechanisms of violence and separation, precisely in order to diversify our understanding of how Israelis and Palestinians and their communities in the Jewish and Palestinian diasporas experience and respond to the conflict. So in this way, the book demonstrates the inherent ambiguities and unclear definitions of Israeli and Palestinian identities, while expanding the visibility of the experiences and environments that the conflict has affected. The key issue then is not who is right and who is wrong about specific disputes. Rather, the issue is that such disputes are manifestations or consequences of cultural divides that as such fail to recognize their own historical evolvement under the influence of separatist politics. Could I have the next slide, please? The book wants to undo this condition precisely by recognizing and analyzing Israeli and Palestinian thoughts, feelings, emotions, impressions, and memories that underpin the conflict, and therefore the cultural frameworks or boundaries that condition Israeli-Palestinian separation in the land of Israel-Palestine and in the diasporas. The book suggests in this respect that the national and Marxist paradigms that often underpin scholarly debates about Israel and Palestine are not so productive, mainly because they tend to focus on subjective criticism and cement separation as a consequence, whereas visioning Israel-Palestine endeavors to prompt empathy, truth, and reconciliation. Could I have the next slide, please? In terms of the chapters in the book, they appear under two parts, one titled Products of Conflict, and the other is titled Products in Conflict. The first part, Products of Conflict, is dedicated to discussions of cultural practices and objects that emerge from within the everyday experiences of the conflict itself, most often in response to personal and collective memories, specific historical events, and particular political realities. The chapters in this section attempt to provide historically and politically informed analysis of cultural products ranging from films, videos, and installations to sculptures, paintings, and text. And their authors expose the cultural tendencies and experiences that trigger the making of these cultural products, as well as the interpretations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that these cultural products foreground. In doing so, they exhibit the dynamic cultural history of the conflict. They demonstrate its implications for the ways one might understand how Israeli and Palestinian identities transform over time, and what living within the cultural boundaries of the conflict might mean more broadly. And you can see on the screen the names of the contributors of this part of the book. So it's Abdul Rahim El-Sheikh, Chrysula Leonis, Anna Ball, and Griselda Pollock. If I could have the next slide, please. This is the second part of the book, Products in Conflict, which revolves more specifically around the question of the power of cultural products to affect the nature of tangible manifestations of the conflict. Here the contributors are Sander Gilman and Rhoda Rosen, who co-authored the chapter, Hugh Wall, Simon Faulkner, myself, and Ihab Salul. These authors trace the active participation of exhibitions, public displays, paintings, photographs, and oral history in the duplication, or if you will, in the recreation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In more practical terms, they demonstrate how the conflict has become manifest in spaces such as museums, city centers, newspapers, and even the privacy of Israeli and Palestinian households, both within the geographical boundaries of Israel-Palestine and once again in the Jewish and Palestinian diasporas. The next and final slide, please. So unavoidably, the book Visioning Israel-Palestine must be seen as another articulation of the conflict's cultural boundaries, but hopefully it creates a sphere for Israelis and Palestinians to encounter each other away from the otherwise separating cultural territories of Israel and Palestine. And putting the volume together in itself was a collaborative work. Admittedly, not all the authors are Israelis or Palestinians, but it was really a long-term project in which most of us shared with each other our contributions. And this way, hopefully, readers will see that the book is actually quite coherent in this sense, despite being an edited volume, bringing together all these ideas and at the same time not compromising or simplifying the different approaches to this highly complex issue of Israel-Palestine, its reality and future. And I think that's a fair description of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gil, for that very, and all three of you, for incredibly exciting, rich, and beautifully presented sense of the projects of the books and the ambitions, the resources, and indeed the significance of this working with concepts, but really touching on some very major and indeed very tender and sensitive, but also powerful issues of our present world. We're going to move now to the discussion of a little mini series which we've been created within New Encounters, which is a project, a collaboration between myself and Max Silverman. I found these two wonderful images of us because we're really quite sweet looking people, but suddenly looking terribly ferocious in our intensity, which is from a website called Disposable Lives, and it's engaged by Bradford Evans, which is really much a larger concept about the exploration of the issues of violence. We are going to be talking about two books that form part of a 4-book series, which emerged under a long-term research project that Max and I have undertaken called Concentration Memories, the Politics of Representation. So I'll hand over to you, Max, to talk about, I don't know if you want to say something about the 4 books before I take off this slide.
Well, thanks very much, Griselda. Excuse my name coming up as Nina Bihal. That's my wife's name, actually, and I'm using her computer, and I didn't change the name, but I am actually Max Silverman. I've got a few minutes to talk, and so I'm going to make 5 points in my 5 minutes that Griselda allowed me. The first point is about the use of the term concentrationary in all of these books, and it's a concept that that we retrieved, a concept first used by David Rousset, who was a returning political deportee to the concentration camps, from the concentration camps, used by others as well, to signify a particular power complex, industrial power complex, that led to the stripping away of humanity. It took place, it's not to be confused then with the exterminatory process that would later become known as the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews. So we went back to this post-war period where a number of French political deportees, not racial deportees, were using this term to define something very particular that took place in the camps, the concentration camps, but not only in the concentration camps, because it related to the wider society in which the camps existed and cannot be seen outside of that wider context. In that sense, then, the concentrationary becomes a concept for how humans can be stripped of their humanity, but not necessarily confined to one place and one time. So this is a traveling concept. The camps are the most egregious time and place that this actually happened, but the use of the concept by Rousset and various others was to suggest that this thing has not disappeared with its Nazi manifestation and lives on in the present in normal society. They came out of normal society and they're still present today in the post-war period. And we would argue, in fact, still today as well. And that's why we feel that it's an important concept to bring back into light. It's therefore a sort of extended definition of the camp. The most famous person to actually use the camp in a way which isn't just situating it as a geographical space is, of course, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. And in a sense, the use of the concentrationary, Agamben himself was influenced by a number of the French writers that I mentioned before in the post-war period. And so his use of the camp as something that defines a wider society and can be found in various different institutions, practices of a society, and not necessarily simply in concentration camps themselves. So this is an extended use of the camp so that it can travel across different times and places. The third point that I wanted to make is about memory, because the book that we've got up in front of us at the moment is called Concentrationary Memories, Totalitarian Terror and Cultural Resistance. And we're using memory related to the concentrationary, a concentrationary memory, in a way, in a very particular sort of way. It's a memory that's invoked then to make us vigilant of what is lurking. It's something that's haunting our present lives and needs to be revealed because it can mutate, it does mutate into different forms. There are various ways in which people can be dehumanized. And so this is a memory which has to jog us out of our way of seeing the normal world. It is influenced by a Brechtian defamiliarization. Certainly the theorists in the period that I mentioned before, in the post-war period, were very influenced by Brecht. And so it does have a link with Brechtian defamiliarization. And it also is coupled with a particular version of art, which Jean Quérol, a name that you've got in front of you there, in a book called Lazarus Amongst Us. And Jean Quérol himself was another returnee from the camps, who defined a particular type of art which was which would enable us to strip away what he called the decor in a film that he made with Alain Resnais in 1955, perhaps one of the greatest films ever made about the camps, called Night and Fog. He talks about seeing beyond the decor, going beyond what is visible in order to reveal to us what is haunting the visible, what is invisible, but nevertheless present. So this is an art that is very different from what has become known as Holocaust art, Holocaust writing, Holocaust visual arts, etc. It's not to do with trauma. It's not to do with survivor testimony. It's not to do with an ethical response to atrocity. It's not to do with perpetrators and victims in the way that we know other sorts of literature about the Holocaust, or art about the Holocaust does take up those terms, and also the whole question of representation or non-representation. It doesn't. This is an art form then, and a memory, which is what we wanted to distinguish from what has become known as Holocaust memory and Holocaust art, and deals with something very different, and also art forms then that also need to be different in order to reveal this thing, in order to resist them. So this is a question of recognizing forms of total domination, what Hannah Arendt called total domination, in order to have an art, create an art of resistance. And finally, my fifth point, the book itself that I'm talking about here, which is Concentrationary Memories, Griselda is going to go on to talk about the second book, has a long introduction by Griselda and me, developing some of the themes that I've just mentioned. And then it has contributions as well by political theorists of forms of total domination, often influenced by Hannah Arendt, especially Hannah Arendt. But the majority of the book actually deals with, the chapters are written by cultural analysts who are seeking, who are looking at artists who sought to find forms, languages, image systems through which to make sense of this lurking presence and to resist this state in which, as Hannah Arendt said, human beings as human beings become superfluous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. And you can see then some of the titles from that particular volume there. It's my pleasure to bring us to the last section, which is to introduce the question of concentrationary imaginaries. This is something that is more speculative. Obviously, concentrationary memories and concentrationary art have the sort of validation of specific writings, whether Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism and her exploration of that, or the political deportees like David Rousset and many others. The question was, to what extent would, if memory of this concentrationary phenomenon that had been invented in the middle of the 20th century, had its roots much earlier in imperialism and colonialism, and now persisted in the forms of dictatorships and even in societies such as South Africa, if the political kind of agitation of memory to make us vigilant about this erosion of the human, erosion of democracy existed, was it perhaps something else more sinister happening as well, whether the concentration was present through a kind of notion of the imaginary, which draws on in part from the psychoanalytical discourses of Lacan about the notion of the imaginary, the realm of fantasies and images, but also in the notion of a colonial imaginary, a kind of more kind of a collection of images and ideas and stereotypes which shape us sort of ideologically and kind of passively get absorbed and become a norm. So a concentrationary imaginary was posed as the possible reionization of René and Kérold's worst fear, that instead of being able to recognize and challenge and resist the continued presence of this concentrationary universe, this corruption of the political possibility of human life, if it's that in our midst, has our culture actually become saturated with its devices and strategies, and that we remain unaware and ignorant of its presence? So this requires a kind of analysis of another set of processes. So if concentrationary memory, the agitation of our vigilance fails, are we unaware that this has not gone away, it's not buried in the past, and could it have seeped, could the totalitarian, which Hannah Arendt argues is this progressive, and systematic stripping of the human subject of the conditions of humanity as she defines them, could this have passed into our cultural imaginary, where it is shaping us and our imaginations in its violent, humanity violating image? Now, this is more than just condemning the violence in the movies. It's particularly to try and understand how plots and narratives and forms of cinema may in a sense be normalizing us, or normalizing the concentrationary and accommodating us to its way of seeing the world and making it appear to be, in fact, worse than just seeing it, but in fact, entertaining. So in concentrationary imaginaries, we are exploring how the concentrationary legacy, revealed and resisted by those writings and artworks and films that are kind of concerned with making us aware of a kind of concentrationary memory, how it's present in a form of a kind of unconscious and politically unprocessed concentrationary imaginary, which required particularly one of our colleagues who worked with us, Benjamin Hanavikusen, to identify a whole different set of systems by which seeping, creeping, and kind of taking over, that one could find it in a whole range of films that had nothing to do, apparently, with historical concentration camps or even the colonial or mid-war periods. This could be something like the Pink Floyd's The Wall. It could be some of the films that deal with, in sense in which we watch, where we do not mourn in a kind of Judith Butler sort of way, we do not mourn the death of certain people. Certain figures are considered surplus, dispensable, and we do not sort of weep at the deaths, we just accept them as part of the narratives. And finally, we're asking ourselves through this, has the concentration seeped from the political real into culture, from politics into entertainment, accommodating us to its insidious erosion of democracy and what Arendt called the human condition, which is plurality, the capacity for action, and the capacity for political transformation through speech within an area of our own communication. So the book contains essays by the Italian philosopher Adriana, it shouldn't be Adrian, I'm sorry, my spelling is so terrible, Adriana Cavarero, and Olivia Guaraldo, Ian James, who's a specialist on Virilio. Sorry?
Virilio, yes.
Virilio, sorry, thank you very much. You're just a little bit younger, help me. The wonderful work of Aaron Kerner, who has done a great deal on Holocaust cinema, but exploring a whole series of concentration dimensions in torture movies. Max is also going to write about Hanukkah, the gentleman, Benjamin Hanavikusen, on recent contemporary films, which he sees where this particular sense of the concentration is used as a device within films, Shutter Island, and Brenda Holweg, whom we also saw in Concentrationary Memories, looking at films which, in fact, one of the films that set me on this, which was not the Nikita herself, but the series of films in which someone is trained to be an assassin. And that was when I first began to think, has this infiltrated in ways that we don't recognize, but it is actually concentrationary. So the tracing of totalitarian terror in popular culture becomes the mirror image of tracing political resistance through aesthetic practices in the formation of concentrationary memories. So hopefully you've got some idea of the project and the ways in which we are using concepts to bring together a number of different works or concentrate in specific studies such as monographs. And we are now in the position to open this up to conversation. So I will stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we'll find that there are some people still left with us who might be interested in posing any kind of questions to any of the authors, or the authors posing questions to each other, or as you've been listening to it. So I think I have somebody in the chat. Somebody has had to leave through elder care, but if you have any questions, please turn your screens on, or your videos, your microphones, and we'd be happy to have a discussion. I don't know if anybody, we see we have Karen Cordero from Mexico, welcome, and others. Okay, so while we wait for people to come forward with some of those, are there any comments anybody would like to add from listening to each other? Because of course, individual authors have not necessarily known of each other or known of each other's projects. I wonder if there's any sense that you've perceived certain continuities in this series that now that you see what you're actually part of.
Well, I think what all of the projects touch on is this idea of rendering visible something, which can only be rendered visible because of a way one approaches it, either by making connections or by going in counterintuitive directions, by drawing analogies. That I was struck by that. I mean, you use the word defamiliarization, but I think defamiliarization is something that probably each one of these projects is interested in. Kind of, there's a way of seeing something, and then if one shifts the focus slightly by bringing in another concept or by coming at it from a different position, then what has become accoutumé, ordinary, is no longer that. And that would be one thing. And to think that both as an aesthetic practice and as a political attitude, meaning that the aesthetic form is much more political than one normally thinks. That's what I kind of would say. And I mean, really, on the other, while everyone else is still thinking, Gil, is it Gil? I mean, are you hopeful about the way that there might be I mean, I knew Said quite well, and I knew that he was so insistent on not having two individual states for exactly the reasons that you talk about, why separation would both be politically, philosophically, but just on a very concrete cultural level made no sense. And we've been watching, I mean, some of us have been watching this conflict now for so many decades in a sense of despair, really. But you sounded so hopeful, the idea that on level of culture, on the level of kind of artistic work, there might be the possibility of reconciliation. There might be spaces where precisely that encounter between people is possible, that gets over, that avoids, or that goes beyond the confrontational. I mean, I'm saying all of this as I have what is happening in Washington, D.C. at the moment in mind. So I'm kind of curious about, are you optimistic?
I think I am hopeful, but not in terms of the political and diplomatic processes. I'm much more hopeful with respect to how people on the ground in everyday life, in everyday realities, are forming connections, are willing to open up, are willing to learn from each other, see each other's perspectives. I think putting the volume together to some extent was such work as well, for me to communicate with authors who, I mean, I'm originally from Israel, and communicating with authors who are originally from Palestine in itself is already, in my view, I wouldn't say an achievement, but it's already part of this kind of a process. And in this respect, I think the book is almost a platform that allowed us to start something in this direction. I think, you know, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, of course. And I'm not sure if it means that we're not going to see this conflict for a few more decades. But the short answer to your question, I think there is great hope when it comes to culture, when it comes to individual interrelationships and connections between on one-to-one, as well as in any spaces that are not taking for granted the, as I mentioned in the presentation, the national perspective. Spaces where people can meet each other as people, whatever that may mean. But in this context, I mean, people who refuse to look at each other through national identities alone. And in this respect, I think, in terms of my personal experience, but also in terms of the some of the what should we say, the research that you can read in the book, you can see that actually there is such transformation already happening. It's on a small scale, probably. It's not noticeable. The media definitely doesn't pick on that. It's not as attractive as another horrendous atrocity. But yes, the short answer to your question, I think there is hope. There is something to look forward to, but it also necessitates hard work, I think, on both sides. It's not something that's going to happen on its own either.
I mean, what I'm struck by is that this is a valorization of cultural work. And I mean, I'm saying that in the context of my own university culture, which does not valorize cultural work at all, but only natural scientific work.
Well, yes, that was why I was so thrilled by the initial conference that Gil organized, and we joined in between his university and my university when we first kind of made a platform for exploring this. But also it's very similar to some of the kind of struggles that we have in terms of decolonizing and ending white supremacy, which is the what you're calling this cultural work. You go out and create the frameworks under the rubric of investigation, research, listening, attentiveness. But, you know, it wasn't a huge work that Gil did, because we had one or two contacts, etc. But actually fashioning the book, creating that space within the book, within which everybody felt they could participate, they could sign their name to it. And I know you had some quite interesting conversations about, you know, Israel-Palestine, you know, what are you going to actually literally call it? But that is itself then conceptualizing this this encounter. There is a separation, but there's not there's not a slash. There's a bridging and things. And this is this question of relating to the concentration imaginaries, which is, as it were, the underside. But you can also have, in a sense, a liberational, a progressive imaginary, which is you put in front of people images they think, well, that is possible, right? There's something that shifts. So I think what Elisabeth, you're talking about, there's a sort of the cultural work, which goes back to this notion of cultural analysis. How do we enable ourselves to say this work is crucial? So if I could just take a few more seconds in relation to concentration imaginaries and the publication of these two books in paperback, which is what we're launching with Bloomsbury, and very grateful to them for doing that, is that in writing the afterword for the most recent books on concentrationary art and this, we were very curiously and intensely aware of what happened in 2016 and now, how all of a sudden we felt that and found people writing, could democracy literally be eviscerated from within? Could democracies literally end not with violence and war, but at the ballot box, and in fact at the level of statements of truth or untruth or imagery or social media. So this attentiveness to both the kind of work of cultural imagination as proposing something which overcomes some of the boundaries to our thinking and real boundaries, but at the same time acute awareness of our kind of fragility for this to be manipulated and for us to inhabit, like that they actually literally are, deciding the impeachment today in the United States on the basis of something where the framework of political encounter discussion is based on a kind of almost a concentrationary kind of sense of lies and deceits and and misrepresentation. So we feel that the concentrationary is a very crucial one, and in some senses it's also a key to some aspects of the negative side of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, as indeed, as you could see, it was very crucial for Latin America. Laura Malasetti Costa looking at it in relation to dictatorships, and I've written it in relation to South Africa, that it's a term that's is very resonant today. It's very apposite for certain historical things, but what is the opposite of the concentrationary is cultural work, a kind of creative, innovative, transformative, critical, and conceptual transformation that comes back to us as literally an opening of the mind to possibilities that are trapped in existing words, statements, imaginaries.
If I can add to that very briefly, and I'm probably going to state the obvious, but I think one of the greatest pleasure for me about putting this book together was the fact that it is an edited volume. It meant that it enabled me to really bring together views that are not necessarily in line with each other. They don't necessarily agree with one another, but at the same time, in the space of the book, they exist peacefully together, side by side, and they enable the readers to explore and experience all these different perspectives without really generating any internal conflicts between them. So you get this kind of mosaic of opinions, of views, of points of views, which I think this is the moment where you expand the vision of what Israel-Palestine can be. This is where you can start seeing what these people actually think about, what troubles them, what makes them feel anxious about. And I think this is where we start finding a way forward. Again, probably not from a political perspective per se, but in terms of culture, in terms of cultural interaction, encounters between readers, as well as between the two peoples on both sides of the conflict.
I was just going to say, and there's a question for you, Griselda, actually in the chat, which is picking up on something that I was going to point out. Your use of the notion of normalizing in relationship to the concentrationary, I think has lots of further possibilities, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about how explicit racism has become normalized. I mean, there are all kinds of things that have seeped through and can now be said, and people not having noticed them. And I think it would be interesting to track not the obvious places, because this is the way I understand your book project, not to look at those obvious films, but to look at films like what you said about Shutter Island, where you wouldn't really think about it in those terms. But once someone says, yeah, but wait a minute, the logic behind this is that one then can then see how certain certain violences, I would say, become naturalized, not simply by glorifying them or making them enjoyable, but in fact by them just becoming part of the texture of how a story develops or what happens to certain characters, etc. Right, and the counterpoint, this is what Leanne wants to know. The explicit deployment of violence as a deterrence, rather than the pointing out of implicit violence.
Yes, no, I'm interested in the chat. The question for the deployment of violence for entertainment normalizes and inhibits responsibility, or in the sense of the ability to respond. I was wondering if we had thoughts about violent imagery and the deterrence, I don't think they are quite the same things, because I think if you purposely show people something for the to indicate that this is a dangerous thing to enter into, such as smoking, or that, you know, that there is real danger. It's the question of the concentration. I'm sure, Max, you'd like to come in on this at some point. It's that it's the logic of it. So what Hannah Arendt revealed is the camp is a system that has visible camps where particularly extreme physical violence is practiced, of torture, overwork, you know, brutality and sadism and underfeeding. So just remind you that, you know, extermination camps, you do not live for more than a few hours of arrival. Concentration camps, people lived for 5-10 years if they could survive, but were intended to live through the agony of knowing they were isolated from the world. Nobody knew about the worlds they were living in, and this was part of the kind of torture. So the sort of, there are camps, but the effect of a society that has camps, that's what Rousset and others said, it politically eviscerates the entire society. It's part of a kind of terrorizing of the society. And insofar as linking up in sense with Elisabeth's things, which is when you have narratives or whether you have films, it's not that they are films about the camps, they're not repeating this, but it's where this campness comes in as a sort of structural dimension. So that, again, in Shutter Island, and I shouldn't speak for Benjamin for his very beautiful analysis, but it is in the book, of the relationship between the asylum, the sense of these spaces apart, and the kind of causes of the violence that is that the Leonardo DiCaprio character does not know what he has done, but then what part of his memory work, or one of the kind of processes in it, is the memory of being at Dachau and liberating the camp, right? So it's quite a complicated set of movements which the film bounds together, that takes a certain amount of enabling, of a kind of creeping of something, whereas what Benjamin identified was a whole series of different kind of specific evocations of the images of the camps that took place without any logic, apparently. And some of them are seeping, some of them are creeping, rather like, you know, what we call, he took this term from military, the military creep, you know, that a project, you know, extends without formally being extended, and it extends its kind of range. So he identified these different kinds of ways the images work, which you'd have to read the chapter, which is to catch it, so that we're not making some kind of vast generalization. It always comes back to the detailed analysis of how it works in anything, which I think does link with the kind of thing that you do, Elisabeth, and what you said at the beginning about persistences, recurrences in a kind of specific way. But I think that the overt use of violence is a very, you know, a purposeful use of violence or of violent imagery has a different logic and has a different kind of ethics and politics. It's that sense of our coming to accept a level of casual dispensing of, you know, that certain people are surplus, that they can be killed, which is similar to, you know, sort of Agamemnon's who can be killed without it being a crime. How has that become a norm? Which, because that was a norm for the camp, that this was not a murder, this was just squashing a gnat. That is the thing that really worries me, but also how many kind of instances we have in what becomes our cultural entertainment of environments in which certain kinds of laws of human life are just suspended. So I do think there is for me, a sense that a daring to ask this question, is the increase of violence as a form of entertainment also as a kind of premise of the conditions of a particular narrative, is that a sign of this process of erosion. That is the legacy.
Yeah. Can I just briefly just go on from what Griselda was saying there, because there's something very specific about the concentrationary that certainly doesn't deal with overt violence. So it is in fact quite the opposite. Jean Quérol, who was one of the French returning deportees that I mentioned, and Griselda did as well, he wrote a whole series of novels. He doesn't talk about the camps. It's not to do with the violence that he suffered, the violence that other people suffered. It's so in terms of an art form, it's allusive, it's indirect, it's sometimes allegorical, it's everything other than explicit. It's something like, to massively generalize, it's a sort of Matrix-like version of reality that we have to actually see through, see how it's actually functioning when it's not in plain sight. It's that sort of art rather than, and I think Griselda is absolutely right that to talk about, when we talk about the way violence has become normalized, I think that's a different discussion. And it's not the same as what the concentrationary actually signifies.
And I think,
can I just clarify that, because otherwise it looks as if we're arguing with each other. So the question of concentration memory, concentration art, is the point of a critical engagement with this awareness to it, whereas the concentration imaginary is to look at the sense of how the elements of the logic of the concentrationary camp world, the erosion of human life and dehumanizing, has become normalized. So that's why the two faces of the critical sense of art and memory are acts of culture as resistance, but this is the lack of resistance, and that is possibly why it's not just violence, sort of spectacular kind of violence, it's to do with what makes us unable to notice a level of human dispensability. We accept it. That's what I think, and that element of it. So just want to pick up on Isabelle before we come to an end, because I think your particular thing is so important, Isabelle, around the locations, and links up with Gil's in sense of communities, you know, negotiating histories of conflict. I mean, ultimately erupting in something as terrifying as civil war, and then also, but literally the sort of the suffering of the cities, the physical fabric, and the place of subjectivity. That seems to me so intriguing, in the fact that your book is about very specific artistic practices that dealt with witnessing something from a distance, working with people who've become the carriers of the terrible crime of Srebrenica, which has not got the same historical register for people as the Holocaust, and yet it was, you know, I mean, it's rather like, you know, the Rwanda and the many other, you know, what happened in East Timor. There are so many sites of this that we need to bring forward through art. But I think that maybe, I don't know if you want to say something, because I mean, since.
Yes, because when I was doing my research at the beginning, I was always hoping to make like a general survey, you know, of what was going on in terms of art and what was going on in Beirut and Sarajevo. And then I was traveling, I traveled many times to both places. And then I lived in Beirut, but after the research, and I was teaching art history there for 4 years. And you can really notice that it's exactly the same when you speak about, you know, the concentrationary, and you speak about the people giving testimonies afterwards. They are never the same, because if you live in different neighborhoods in Beirut, and if you live in different communities, you don't actually experience the same events, but in the same way. So that's why I just noticed fairly early in the research that we cannot generalize. So we cannot speak about generalizations for, and this is why I singled out these 4 different practices, and it was very difficult task for me to actually decide on which artists and which actually series or artworks for each artist I wanted to work. Because the suffering is there, but it is expressed, it is lived, it is expressed so differently from one person to another. And then what was also interesting is this way of mediating, you know, traumatic events for the artist, because the entire neighborhood cannot express that, cannot speak for themselves, but they recognize themselves in the artwork. And I think when we talk about the suffering of the city, I mean, I was really, of course, devastated by what happened, even if I don't live in Beirut any longer. But when I saw what happened in August, and, you know, I was, of course, calling up friends, and just when you speak about the suffering of a city, and when you saw the images, I mean, post-explosion and all these terrible damages and all this building, you know, half collapsing, and all people were really walking on in glass. I mean, all the roads, everything was covered in glass, and you had this very, very special sound of glass when people were trying to walk, just to, you know, to carry on there with and trying to organize themselves, and they didn't know where to start. And Gil, one of the images you saw of an artist I saw was represented by Silverman gallery, which is in Hamburg and in Beirut. And I've been in touch with them, and the gallery was totally destroyed. And I also heard, you know, also in terms of artistic practices, what because it's important for me to raise this point about this now, is that everybody is asking what's going on in Beirut, and we're very curious to see what artists are creating. But it's just, for me, it's just that we're not in a time of sensation. It is not because this happened and we are just expecting from our little, you know, comfortable homes to see what the artist and the suffering artist will create. It's not what matters right now. I think they are, and this is also why they are in a way for us, because we live in the instant nowadays, which is also always, you know, which has its advantages and disadvantages to do it. But I think what people I know, I mean, artists lost their studios, they lost their homes. I know of galleries who were just, you know, totally just destroyed to the ground. I was myself, I used to live just next to the harbor. I saw pictures of a street where I used to live and so on. And I think they are in the middle of a terrible economic crisis, on top of a pandemic, and on top of everything. The political system is kind of collapsing, but the politics and the politicians are still in place. This is, I mean, people are getting like 20% of their former salary nowadays, and they have to survive with that. So we cannot just expect them to produce right now, but I think we can expect them to reflect on how they want to produce once they are ready to start producing artworks. And this is what really matters for me, because I also asked, you know, to give a conference on the post-explosion in Beirut, because there was this sculpture put into the harbor, which represents a woman and with a clock, and the clock is showing the exact time of the explosion. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to reflect on that, because this is just sensation. And I don't even know the artist, first of all. I don't know who allowed this artist to put this sculpture in this place. And it's not the kind of art I'm dealing with, because as you know, the art in a way is traumatic because it arouses something in the viewer. It's not that it's a very violent art to see, and you saw the artworks that I was showing. It's not something violent, but it's just something which makes us feel something and reflect, and then make, and it's like an encounter actually with this kind of artworks, and we want to know more once we see them, but not everything is available at the first level.
That's a wonderful, wonderful statement, I think, with which we are coming to the end of our slot. I think that's correct. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for joining us. Those of you who have listened, thank you for our listeners and audiences. But I'm particularly thrilled that we've been able to assemble us as a kind of community of writers and thinkers with April, who's the wonderful, April Peake, who's present, is our wonderful and incredibly supportive editor for the Bloomsbury, for the art history and art stuff publications. So I hope we'll have this recorded. A little bit at the beginning I lost, but we are all recorded and we will share this with each other, and hopefully people will be interested in the New Encounters way of enabling work, the cultural work to be done. So I hope some of you who have been listening will mention these books and look to New Encounters in the future. So thank you all for joining us. So Isabelle, Max, Elisabeth, Gil, April, and our two faithful listeners, Lynn and Francesca. So have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you so much for being with us. So,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you for doing this, Griselda.
Yeah, Griselda and April, thank you very much
Thank
for the
you.
April,
organization.
Thank you so much, and see you
Thank
soon.
you.
April's the one who we have to thank. She got it organized, and we, I hope, have fulfilled her hopes.
No, absolutely. Your talks were all great. I really enjoyed listening to them, and as kind as you all are for thanking me, I really haven't had to do anything since this has started. So thank you all as well.
Okay, well, have a lovely rest of your weekend, everybody, and I will share the film with you, and then we'll decide how we're going to put it out there for people to follow up.
That would be great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have
Thank
a
you
nice
so much.
weekend,
Bye.
everyone.
Very
Lovely
nice.
Bye.
evening.
Very nice
Bye.
to meet all of you.
Lovely to meet you.